The proceeding will start shortly. 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 The proceeding.
Order, order. This is the Transport Select Committee's first evidence session in our new inquiry, Trains Fit for the Future. Can I first of all welcome our first panel and ask them to introduce themselves, and we'll start with David.
Good morning, my name is David Clark. I'm the Technical Director at the Railway Industry Association, which is the trade association for the railway supply chain, both infrastructure and rolling stock. And thank you for the opportunity to speak to the committee this morning.
Good morning, David, and thank you. And secondly, over to Mary.
Good morning. My name is Mary Grant, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer at Porterbrook. Porterbrook is an asset owner and manager of almost a third of the UK rolling stock, and has been part of the industry for over 25 years now.
Well, good morning, Mary. And finally, Leo.
Good morning, I'm Leo Murray. I am a co-founder and director of innovation at the green tech startup Riding Sunbeams, which is on a corporate mission to power the UK's railways directly with solar PV.
Well, look, good morning, David, Mary and Leo. Thank you for being with us. This inquiry is going to look at the decarbonisation of the railway and really how the engineering will look in the future, not just from the capability of moving the trains, but also how the passenger experience will change as well. So we're very keen to get all of your evidence. Perhaps I can start with an opening question, because it appears that from your evidence, each of you is approaching the rail decarbonisation challenge in slightly different ways and focusing on different technologies. Perhaps could I ask you to set out what actions your organisations are taking in order to decarbonise rail? Perhaps, Mary, we'll start with you.
Okay, thank you. Recognising that long-term strategically, a greater level of electrification is set out in the decarbonisation network strategy is fundamental. But in the short and medium term, there's many things we're doing, and we're already carrying out research, development and integration in the areas of hybridisation. So what does that mean? That's hybrid technology in terms of battery power, also hydrogen power, and also looking at where we can reduce today any emissions out of the necessary requirement of diesel trains, which still have a role to play, a very important role within the network, until we can see further electrification throughout the length and breadth of the UK rail network. So I think there's many things that we're not just talking about, but we're actually starting to see that we can bring into passenger service over the coming years that will support that challenge that we've all been set.
Thank you. And David, I'll ask the same question to you, please.
Thank you. I mean, we obviously haven't heard from Leo yet, but I suspect all three approaches are probably very complementary. So from our perspective, since 2017, we've been really trying to get electrification back on the agenda and decarbonisation back on the agenda. At that point, there was a cancellation of a number of electrification projects, which we felt was, whilst understandable because of some of the problems with some particular projects, we felt that that was the wrong answer long term in terms of decarbonisation. And we've been calling for electrification to be recognised as the first choice really for decarbonisation of the railway. And you'd look at that where you've got freight, you've got speed, or you've got volume. And the kind of solutions that Mary was talking about have a massive role to play also in the places where electrification isn't the right answer, and also in the transition, as Mary highlighted. So we've been working across the industry. We've been involved with the Decarbonisation Task Force, and more recently the snappily titled Traction Decarbonisation Network Strategy that Network Rail have been leading on. And that leads us to a point where, as an industry, we have a map that's starting to show what you would need to do to decarbonise the network. And so the issue now is that we've got the last of the live electrification delivery projects. Midland Main Line to Corby is just ending, and we could end up in the ridiculous situation where we're losing capability when we know we're going to need it in a few years' time. So our call is for a rolling programme of electrification, which this committee has previously called for, supported by fleet orders of low carbon rolling stock. And we need to get on with it. We need to get on with it for two reasons. One is that, as I've previously alluded to, we risk losing capability that we're going to need in a few years. The other one is decarbonisation, because if you save a tonne of carbon in 2020, that's 30 tonnes you've saved by 2050. So that's our viewpoint.
Okay, thank you, David. Now we'll move to Leo, and without wishing to overcomplicate my question, do you feel that perhaps there's too much emphasis on electrification, whereas there are technologies that perhaps may shortly be ready, which will allow us to reduce our reliance on electrification, which ultimately still is a dirty provide?
That is a good question, but I'm afraid I actually don't. I have to say I agree with David. Electrification absolutely sits at the top of the hierarchy for rail decarbonisation for reasons that I think we're going to get the opportunity to go into a bit when we speak about some of the key documents that have come out from the sector in the last couple of years. But what Riding Sunbeams is doing, so if electrification is at the top of this hierarchy, underneath that, there are still opportunities to decarbonise the supply of power to the traction system. So, Network Rail uses about 1% of all electricity in the UK to move trains. So it's the biggest single electricity consumer. And as we continue to electrify, that share, the proportion will rise. So at the moment, most of the decarbonisation that's taken place in the UK has taken place in the power sector, and that we've made great progress, and as a consequence the carbon intensity of the grid in the UK has fallen a great deal and is now 230 grams per kilowatt hour. Now it is still true that a technology like solar PV in the UK is well under 50, never more than 50. So it's about a fifth of the emissions. So what Riding Sunbeams is doing is seeking to substitute some of the power that was being drawn from the grid for direct supply from decentralised generators. Now, they're a very good fit for the railways for lots of different reasons, not least that, you've got all this demand from the railways for power, and it's distributed across thousands of miles of track. Now, that fits very well with a decentralized generation technology like solar PV, which you can effectively put anywhere. So they're very, very good fit for that reason. But it's also the case, we've come at this, I'm not from the rail sector, effectively I've come at this from the renewable energy sector, trying to find somewhere to connect new solar farms to the grid in the UK, which has become extremely difficult to do. Grid capacity constraints, thermal voltage constraints are rife across the country, and the grid charging regime is not suited to bringing forward new renewable generators. And so that's one of the reasons why decentralized technologies like solar and wind in the UK have stalled in the last few years. And the railways represent an alternative route to market for that power. So it's a way to circumvent grid capacity constraints, forget the grid, just feed straight into the traction system. And you can do that almost anywhere on the network, on DC or AC lines. But it's also the case that the railway is the right kind of end user. What we've been told by the government over the last few years with respect to renewables is that they need to stand on their own 2 feet. And it is true to say that the costs of a technology like solar have fallen so far and so fast that we are very confident from our work that we can supply power to the railways at a lower unit price than power supplied from the grid. So we can supply it directly from a solar generator. And the International Energy Agency just recently confirmed that solar is now the cheapest source of energy in history. And that is only going in one direction. And so what we're talking about here is lower cost and much lower carbon power direct to the railways.
Okay, Leo, I'll stop you there because we're going to drill further into the detail. So I'm going to hand over to Robert Largan at this point.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning to the panel. My first question is directly to David. So last March, the RIA published the Electrification Cost Challenge report. Can you tell me what the Department of Transport response to that report has been, and what progress, if any, has been made to implement the recommendations in that report?
Okay, thank you. Well, just for the benefit of the wider committee, what that report did was it examined a number of projects that have been delivered in the previous 5 years, and it identified that 75% of those projects had been delivered at an efficient cost and efficiently in terms of cost and time. The remaining 25% were the well-known problem projects, and the other thing the report did was identify the lessons that could be learned from both the problem projects and the successful projects. So we made a load of recommendations about how we could make sure that 100% of electrification projects were efficiently delivered in the future. So to answer your question in terms of DFT, so DFT have examined that quite closely, and I've had a number of discussions with officials who have been challenging in terms of are those efficiencies actually being delivered on the ground in current projects. And we've worked with Network Rail to demonstrate that that is indeed the case. And most recently, as part of the Transport Decarbonisation Network strategy, we ran a market sounding exercise, which DFT were keen to see happen, where we put a questionnaire out to both infrastructure and rolling stock suppliers to say, effectively, are you ready for the potential decarbonisation activity, and can you demonstrate you've got the capacity and you can deliver efficiently? And the answer was a resounding yes, providing we get a clear strategy that we're confident is going to be funded, and then the industry will swing in and invest in the people, plant and process that's needed. So that's just recently gone to DFT. So my challenge to DFT now is to take all that on board, and through hopefully the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, which we understand will emerge in the new year, to get behind it and give the industry a strategy that we can work against.
Okay, great. Thank you, David. And now I'm a big supporter of electrification, but to play devil's advocate for a moment, given that the very high cost and sometimes failure of previous electrification projects, we all know about the problems with the Great Western Line, but why should the Treasury trust the findings that electrification can be delivered for 33% lower cost than in earlier projects? What's the comfort we have that those projections are accurate?
Okay. Well, the comfort with that is that the recently completed projects, the last phase of Great Western from Bristol to Cardiff and Midland Main Line, have been delivered in that cost range. And recent estimates that Network Rail are doing for potential projects in the future, like balance of Midland Main Line and TransPennine, are coming out in that cost range. Scotland has been consistently delivering in that cost range. After they had a blip with the Egypt, the Edinburgh-Glasgow, they learned their lessons from that and applied the lessons. So I'm very confident we've got, we're not looking to the future and saying if we do a million things and cross our fingers, we'll be able to deliver efficiently. I'm looking backwards at projects that have been delivered efficiently. Now, against that, we've got the problem, to put it mildly, that was Great Western. And the issue with Great Western was that an industry we rushed into doing a volume, a big project, but not just one big project. We rushed in to try to do 10 all at once. And if you haven't done something for 20 years, which is the case here, you're likely to be a bit out of practice. And so that didn't go well. And we need to not repeat that, which is why we're calling for a ramping up starting now towards those higher volumes, rather than a sudden leap to huge volumes, which is, as we know from past experiences, not wise.
Thanks, David. Let's hope the DfT are listening. The other question I would ask then is more of a technical one. You referred to in your answer to the opening question from Hugh, how for some lines electrification isn't the answer and it's not possible. It'd be useful to understand from a more technical standpoint, what is it that means that electrification isn't suitable on certain lines? What are the challenges that make that not possible?
Well, technically, electrification is suitable for any line. The issue is cost. So you would apply electrification where the cost can be outweighed by the fact that you're running freight, which needs the energy that electrification can provide. At the moment, we have a challenge for freight, which I think you'll hear more from the next panel, where other solutions don't have the energy density to haul a freight train. So if you've got freight, if you've got high speed, if you've got intense railways like commuter railways, then electrification is really your only answer if you can't use diesel. Now that then leaves a fair bit of the network where those things don't apply, the less intensively used parts of the passenger network. And there you couldn't really, although electrification would be a perfectly valid technical solution, it wouldn't be a sensible economic solution. So those are the places where you wouldn't put the wires up, and you'd look to use other technologies, be it battery or hydrogen, or in the short term, there's a number of options we could do to make diesel more efficient, and there's a number of things we could do to convert existing rolling stock to give it a life extension to help us manage the transition. Going back to the point that I made earlier, that the more carbon we save now, early, the better. A ton now is 30 tons over the next 30 years.
Great, thank you, David. They're really helpful answers. And Chair, back to you.
Thank you. And Mary, perhaps I could just bring you back on this point, because Robert and I have touched on it with Leo and David. I mean, if we accept that there is some capability where you need electrification, and then there's other capability where hydrogen or battery could get it right, is there a danger that we put everything into electrification now, when in fact just round the corner could be cleaner and cheaper alternatives, which we then lose? Do you have a view on that?
So in response, I would suggest that the consideration at present of the 11,700 single track kilometres of proposed electrification is still being validated, and I think there still remains about 2,300 that's unclear in terms of what is the most viable solution, coming on, responding to David's points about cost and benefit. But I think what we've got ahead of us right now, and that's what we're doing at Porterbrook, is actually assessing the viability to support a core electrified route in hydrogen, hybrid and battery. Because what we have a responsibility is recognising that, to get the best value of the asset over its entire life spans across a 30-year period. And so we have got to assess now that we can ensure that those assets stay relevant to support the network. So I would suggest that what we're doing now is demonstrating alternatives. And whilst the Traction Decarbonisation Strategy Group is validating the kilometres of track that should be upgraded to support the future of railway, we can demonstrate the blended supporting solutions that can give that infill, that can support discontinuous electrification, because you could have a part electrified route that could then go on to hydrogen or battery. And that's the technologies that we're developing as part of our fleet portfolio R&D and working with our university partners at Birmingham, as well as other supply chain partners, to make sure that we're ready to respond to the government's needs now, not 5 or 6 or 7 years down the road. But of course, this whole TDNS strategy spans over a 30+ year trajectory. So there's many things that we can be doing now, which we are, even reducing air quality by after exhaust treatment on older, near life expired diesel trains that still have a very important part to play within the network today. So that journey, I think, is starting now, and it's a responsible one that we should all be taking and considering.
Thanks, Mary. Thank you very much indeed. Right, let's start drilling into the Rail Industry Decarbonisation Task Force report. What a terrible title. Greg, over to you.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, everyone. There is nothing so unclear as a state-sponsored report in the way that they word the title. But on the Rail Industry Decarbonisation Task Force, you'll all be aware that the final report was published before the last general election in July 2019, had 5 key recommendations, or 5 key areas of recommendation in there. Just as a starter before we go into the detail, could I ask you all your view on 16 months after this report has been published, how satisfied you are that there has been any progress on it, where you think the key progress has been, and on the other side of that coin, what is still lacking 16 months on from the publication of that report? Should we start with Mary?
So I would say that for the first time, we're starting to see a potential roadmap of a 30-year strategy. And that's pleasing because, again, when you're looking at procuring assets and rolling stock, you need to take a long-term view because they have a long-term life value. So I think there has been a clarity that we haven't seen so much before. The ask now is to see that come to a more firm commitment so that we can take the right level of decision-making to support the infill requirements whilst an electrified rollout does or doesn't materialise to the degree that is currently being proposed to support the 2014, of course, 2035 targets set in England and Scotland, respectively.
Thank you. David, have you got some thoughts on that one?
Thank you. I have to declare an interest because I was a member of the task force. And the task force was actually an industry group that was put together to respond to the challenge of the then rail minister to eliminate diesel-only trains by 2040. So we investigated and wrote a report and offered that to government. The main conclusion, which I think had been perhaps in doubt up to that point, was that it was actually possible to decarbonise by 2040. In terms of progress, one of our main recommendations was that then needed to be turned into a strategy, and that's what the TDNS has done. I mean, it would have been great if it could have been done quicker, but there's been quite a bit of work involved. The thing that could have been done, which hasn't been done, and we were calling for, is there were both electrification projects that are so-called no regrets projects, where it's fairly obvious that in any scenario you'd electrify those in the long term, and decisions could have been made about those in the meantime. So as they haven't been, it would be great to see decisions being made about those very soon. The other thing that's happened in that time frame is Mary's business and other businesses have been busy demonstrating that low carbon rolling stock is feasible, and Leo has been demonstrating that there are direct wire solutions for renewable energy. So we've not been standing still. I think in that last 18 months, certainly around low carbon rolling stock and things like direct wire renewables, we have moved forward and demonstrated that what was a theory before is now practical, and you could actually start ordering it, and that's really what we'd like to see. My final point is that in the normal course of events, railway funding comes in 5-year cycles. The next cycle is 2024, and the real challenge is that we shouldn't wait till 2024 to start getting on with this.
Okay, that's helpful. Before we dig in a little deeper, Leo, do you have... I can see you nodding away to a lot of that.
Yes. I think my only complaint, about the what the Decarbonisation Task Force report said was we need to turn this into a strategy, and now we have the Traction Decarbonisation Network Strategy. My only sort of gripe, I think, with how one has led to the other is that the Decarbonisation Task Force report highlighted the fact that because of the advent of onboard battery storage on rolling stock, it's now possible, this is a quote from the report, to assess electrification across a range of options rather than just a binary yes/no decision. And so, intermittent, discrete electrification, it's a much lower cost option, and it's not really explored in the Traction Decarbonisation Network Strategy. So it doesn't really feature in there. It was explicitly excluded for reasons I don't completely understand. And to be perfectly frank, our view at Riding Sunbeams is that intermittent electrification is quite likely to be a better option ultimately for some of the routes that have been identified for hydrogen. The last point on this is my concern, our concern at Riding Sunbeams about the push for hydrogen is that green hydrogen is still a hypothetical at this point, and actually existing hydrogen feedstocks are coming from steam methane reformation, and even if you do electrolysis from grid supplied power in the UK, you don't get any carbon saving on a diesel hybrid. So there is no carbon saving from hydrogen, and so there's an enormous amount of uncertainty around the future capability of hydrogen to deliver substantial emissions reductions. So we're sceptical about its role, and then meanwhile, intermittent electrification, which is potentially an alternative option for some of those routes which are difficult to treat with full electrification, doesn't seem to have been given the time we would have liked to have seen in it. So thanks.
Okay, that's interesting. Can I potentially become a little bit awkward to challenge some of the presumptions here? I always think back to shift to a different mode of transport, road and private cars. If we go back 20 years, the presumption was the Blair-Brown government told everyone to go and buy a diesel car, the European Union told everyone to go and buy a diesel car, everyone thought diesel was the environmentally preferred fuel to put in a private car, and of course, that turned out to be absolute nonsense from an environmental perspective. And everybody is now trying to get rid of diesel, or diesel as the older technology of diesel as it was. And it worries me when we look at strategies and task forces and plans that go over multiple decades, that how sure can we be that electrification is actually going to deliver those long-term carbon savings, or even getting to net zero, or even some sort of technology that reverses the trend? How certain can we be that we've actually got it right, and we're just grabbing the technology of today at the cost of technology that you say green hydrogen is hypothetical, but scientists are pretty good at what they do, and hypothetical technologies often become real technologies, sometimes quicker than anyone expects. And just to throw into that, if you can reflect on those thoughts, a real life example of something that is supposedly being done in the name of decarbonisation, or certainly part of the business cases in the name of decarbonisation. I don't agree with this presumption, and that is, of course, the railway that the government is building at the moment in the form of HS2, which actually, if you look at the whole life cycle of HS2, if you look at some of the data from the construction to the operation of that railway, it's still going to be a carbon contributor in 120 years' time. So when we are looking at these projects, how can we be certain that we are getting them right now, and how can we actually be certain that rather than just looking at the while the wheels are turning element of it, we're looking at the whole life cycle of construction, operation, replacement of rolling stock, etc., into the future? Leo, did you want to go
Mary,
first on that?
Mind if I jump in first?
Yeah.
Yes. So where to begin with that? I think that let's park HS2 because I'm familiar with the figures that you've cited, but they're certainly contested. But I don't think this session is about HS2. But with respect to this, I'm a huge fan of technology innovation, and that's my role here and in my other work at our parent charity, Possible. The problem is that decisions need to be made today because of the very long time horizons around investment in the rail sector. A train will be on the tracks for 30, 35 years. Because of those time horizons and the pressing need to decarbonize, I think we need to pick winners at this point. And electrification is known technology. So when you ask the question, how confident can we be? What we can be absolutely confident of is that electrification, plus the kind of thing that we do at Riding Sunbeams, will certainly deliver emissions reductions at the scale and speed which is required by the Climate Change Act. We cannot be confident that is true for hydrogen. Where the uncertainty comes in is around cost. And I take your point that there may be some unexpected leap in technology which makes it look like we made a bad decision back in the early 2020s to do all this electrification. But I have to say it's not obvious on the horizon. And the work that has been done in the industry to the horizon scanning that's been done. My major complaint about the flagging of uncertainty around battery costs and hydrogen costs in both of these documents is that actually battery costs are really quite well known and understood and are on an experience curve, right? They're at global scale production, they're on an experience curve, they are falling. They're certainly going to continue to fall. The cost with hydrogen, again, this is, the level of uncertainty for hydrogen versus the level of uncertainty for batteries. These are not comparable. Batteries is basically known. It's not a fully mature technology sector yet, but we can see the trajectory that's on. It's visible. So I think that is all I will say about this. We've got to make decisions now, and we should choose the things which we actually know will work.
Okay, thank you, David. I think you had your hand up quite a lot of that.
Yes, thank you. The beauty of electrification is it can do anything you need to do on the railway. It can, as I said before, it can haul freight trains, high-speed trains, ideal for intensively used networks. And the beauty of it is you don't have to carry your power around with you. For hydrogen and battery, you have to carry your power around with you. And that takes up quite a lot of space, which means that hydrogen and battery, even if there's the great, most ambitious levels of improvement in its energy density and indeed cost, then it's highly unlikely that it's going to be able to do those sort of duty cycles. Now, if we are setting out a 30-year program and we crack on for the first 15, 20 years, electrifying the core bits of the network and rolling out low carbon rolling stock, we will know a lot more about that technology when we're deciding about the last 10 years. And I could entirely see there being more hydrogen and battery in that last 10 years displacing some electrification, but it's not going to be displacing electrification in its entirety.
Okay, thank you for that, and that's very, very helpful. I know Leo wanted to park the point about HS2. I didn't raise it just because it is a particular hobby horse of mine in my opposition to it, but I think it is as we're looking at long-term decarbonisation plans and the rail industry, HS2 is undoubtedly the biggest railway project that is being built in the United Kingdom today. Given the data around it, which I accept that different parties will contest to various degrees, but even within HS2 Limited's own documents, it shows that there'll still be a carbon contributor after 120 years. How can we take seriously targets of 2040, of net zero by 2050, when we're building railways, they're going to be carbon contributors, and how do we ensure that construction phases, maintenance phases, rolling stock changes are included within carbon targets and within assessments of how we're actually doing and delivering on decarbonisation?
I'll ask for brief answers on this one, if that's all right, Greg, because otherwise I won't get through the rest. But who did you want to come?
David, did you want to just briefly come back on that, and maybe Mary?
Yeah, just very quickly, the point I would make is that what isn't in HS2's calculations is the modal shift that HS2 can drive by, so it releases huge capacity, for example, on the West Coast Main Line, which we can use to run additional freight and local passenger trains, which will drive modal shift and potentially take traffic off the road. And I did that piece of the car isn't in their calculations, which it really should be. I agree we've got to do a lot more in looking at major projects in terms of embedded carbon, but part of that is making sure that you use assets like trains for the whole of their life. So I'll hand over to others.
Mary, what were your thoughts? Thank you.
So my thoughts from a rolling stock perspective, and you're quite right, how can we be sure? I think we need to set out and specify the parameters. So when any new rolling stock's being built, how that carbon's being created. For example, a typical vehicle today will create the equivalent of 146 tonnes of CO2, and its in-year maintenance, to put it into context, is about 2.3 tonnes. So the very large quantum of carbon is created when that product is produced. As David said, it's a 35 year asset, but it's also about the materials, it's about the whole supply chain from a sustainable perspective, and then it's also about how that product is used throughout its entire cycle. And I think we should be putting down those parameters of what a very responsible environmental footprint looks like for both current to improve that environment, but also in building new going forward, to give those certainties that actually it's not just a box that's been ticked on further electrification. The actual whole either manufacturing or construction or any part of it is also being responsible to support the carbon targets that we're all being challenged to meet.
Thank you.
Greg, thank you very much. We're going to turn now to Network Rail's Traction Decarbonisation Network Strategy. As you've touched upon, there's a sort of opportunity for 15,400 single track kilometres which have not been electrified, and what the choice will be for those over the coming decades. I'll turn first to Gavin Newlands and then Lillian Greenwood. Gavin.
Thanks very much, Chair. And as the Chair rightly said, this touched on issues that have been raised already in question 1 and subsequent questions, but the strategy recognises the huge importance of electrification, and that it should electrify the vast majority of the network, but it has been under-delivering in terms of single track kilometres on an annual basis. But obviously it recognises that hydrogen and battery have their roles to play, but can I ask all three of you, do you accept the findings in the strategy about how electric, hydrogen and battery should be deployed across the network? And start with Mary.
In short answer, yes. There's still obviously the devil is in the detail, but certainly welcome the quantum. You know, it's 11,700 electric vis-a-vis 900 of hydrogen, 400 battery, 2,300 is still unclear. So it's around the parameters as to, is that the absolute right blend? And then, of course, it'll be prioritisation in terms of the routes that need to see the electrification or alternative support happen in what control period. And that's what I'm particularly interested to see in that next stage of commitment of saying where and when, so that we can plan and create the best quantum and output to both customer, passenger, taxpayer.
Thanks, Mary. Leo?
Yes, I mean, in the main, I had chills reading that document. It's very, very exciting, and it basically recommends 13,000 more single track kilometres of electrification, and that's double what we have today. And that's that is very exciting. I think I've already said I'm sceptical about the role that is envisaged for hydrogen. I'm persuadable about this, but my main issue with the work that's being done is that what's not being looked at for these lines is an option around intermittent electrification, where you have onboard battery storage. You've got bi-mode trains. Batteries and electrification are synergistic technologies. They work absolutely hand in glove, whereas hydrogen is a completely separate and distinct traction pathway for rolling stock. And so my instinct certainly would be to favour batteries where possible, and the advantage that hydrogen has, the principal advantage it has over batteries is range. There's not much of a speed advantage, and actually I think battery trains can charge on the move, running under the wires, and so just putting overhead line on some short sections of the routes which are currently been earmarked for hydrogen trains, that's not been assessed in this, and I think I'd want to see that assessment, comparing those options before conceding that hydrogen is the right thing to do here. Otherwise, that's very exciting. I would just say Pathway 4. I don't know if you've looked at the economic assessment, but Pathway 4 is a 2040 net zero goal, and it gets us there fastest, but it also represents the best value for money, and that is because, as David has stressed, if you front load the emissions cuts now, that's cumulative over time, and so the value of doing it faster is better. Thank you.
Okay, no, thanks. I'm just conscious of time. David, if you could answer, because I've got one quick follow-up question as well.
Yes, I do support the conclusions of the TDNS. What's especially important is it's starting to draw out a plan, and once that's converted into a funded plan that industry can plan against, that'll be really important. As I said before, maybe for the sort of 2030 to 40 time frame on the plan, or we will, if we review the plan, say every 10 years, we can take on board emerging technology. A couple of other quick points. The reason there's a lot of electrification in that program compared to what some might have expected is because of freight. We need to run freight trains, and that drives a higher level of electrification. Last quick point is that this is a fantastic thing for the industry and for the country. If we employ an apprentice tomorrow to start doing electrification or low carbon rolling stock, they've got 30 years of work in front of them. That's a good thing, I think.
And David, sticking with you, you mentioned yourself about the cancellation of a number of electrification projects, I presume in England and Wales. Why do you think that is? Why do you think so many have been cancelled? And why do you think there's a difference in approach, or certainly a difference in the decision-making process when it comes to these electrification projects in Scotland versus England? Why is, again, I'm not looking to make a political point here, because we all want to see the tracks electrified and what have you. I'm just curious as to what the difference is.
But the difference is essentially the projects in England and Wales, some of them had gone badly wrong, and the government lost confidence in the industry's ability to deliver, and so they curtailed those projects until the industry could demonstrate that we could deliver efficiently. The Electrification Cost Challenge report that we did demonstrated that actually, especially when you included analysing what was going on in Scotland, then 75% of the projects were being delivered efficiently. I mean, frankly, Scotland had one problem project, Edinburgh-Glasgow Improvement Project. The team in Scotland learned their lessons quickly and applied them more quickly, and so subsequent projects were delivered efficiently. Frankly, we're taking the lessons from Scotland and applying them throughout the UK to deliver efficiently. And as I mentioned earlier, recent projects have delivered efficiently.
Okay, thanks. Mary, just ran back. Do you concur with that? Is there anything you'd like to add?
I support David, but I think we should be ambitious with the development of hydrogen, and if we're looking at renewable and green energy in the future, which we should be considering, not fossil fuels. I agree with Leo on that. There is a role for it, and for example, we are developing our hydrogen train. It's mainline testing now. That's an electric hydrogen proposition. So I think there are solutions that can support the core electrification networks, but we must embrace hydrogen, because I think it also creates a renewable industry that, as an economy, has an opportunity for us and skills and jobs and support longer term over this next 30 years. And that's why we're doing this type of technology and R&D with the University of Birmingham now.
Okay, thanks. Conscious of time, Chair, I'll pass back to you.
Great. I'm going to pass straight back to Lillian Greenwood.
Chair, and good morning, David, Mary and Leo. I'll try not to take too long, but I've got the first question really is about the role that hydrogen could play. Maybe Mary, I can come to you as you're developing the hydrogen train. I want to be clear about, so I think we've heard and we know that at the moment hydrogen can't power trains to 125 miles an hour. It can't haul freight, and it isn't so good for intensively used lines where you kind of, needing fast acceleration. My question is, could hydrogen ever do those things? Is it about economics or is it about physics? What's the answer? Now, Lillian, I would probably be good if I had Helen with me right now, but I don't. But it would, and she's listening. It's a combination of both. I think the important thing that we need for hydrogen is it's in a developmental phase for us using it within heavy rail in the UK, but we need a whole economy, a whole infrastructure economy around delivering hydrogen. We've had the announcement of the Tees Valley Hydrogen Hub that will bring business, R&D and the supply chain together to learn how to incorporate that within a network. At the moment, we're developing our rafts that go underneath the train to be able to do a duty cycle up to, say, 75 miles per hour that would support not key arterial main route services or freight, but can still support the more regional routes. But also it's then about being able to bring highly pressurized refueling systems because of the low density of the fuel, and that's the whole infrastructure that we're creating and learning and working with, not just developing a train that we can say, right, that can go into passenger service, because it can't in isolation. We need the capability of bringing green hydrogen, storing and then refueling into the whole system to make it work. But I think we can bring it, and we should be ambitious, and we should be considering where it's right in different parts of the country. And the TDNS report has identified where that might fit within the north of Scotland or over in East Anglia and other parts of the northeast of England. Okay, thanks. So my second question is, at the moment in the UK, 58% of passenger trains, 96% of freight trains are powered by diesel. That compares with 26%, 44% in Europe. And we also lag behind China, Japan, India. What can we learn from other countries' approaches? And is there anything interesting happening in other places internationally? I don't know who's best placed to answer this question. I don't know, Leo, is that something you could pick?
Well, I'll have a go. To be honest, David is probably best placed, but we all know the answer, you see, Lillian, which is a rolling programme. The reason why we've had such fluctuating costs for electrification in the UK, the fundamental reason is a feast or famine approach, which isn't in the gift of the rail industry. These are decisions which are made by government. So, a lot's been kind of put on the rail industry as, failing to deliver projects at cost. But actually, the lesson from those other countries which you cite, who are further down this track, is you just have to have a rolling programme, because it intrinsically reduces costs through experience curves. So. David might want to say something more, but
David, well, I was going to come to David last because I've got one other question. I mean, obviously, I agree entirely about a rolling programme. David, in answer to an earlier question, you mentioned some no regrets projects, so things that you should do and get on with. Can you just explain what those are?
Okay, so those are projects where where the characteristics of the railway are typically high speed, intensively used for passenger or freight, that aren't currently electrified. And it's not hard to identify those. In fact, quite a lot of them are already, as the term is, shovel ready. So there are projects that, for example, the north end of the Midland Main Line and TransPennine, which are well developed in terms of design and are ready to go into delivery. So my approach would be, first of all, to progress with those, to contract to deliver the projects that are ready to be delivered. At the same time, commission the design of the next tranche of projects that are obviously on that map, and we can now go to the TDNS and find that map of the bits that you would electrify. And thirdly, start to procure fleets of low carbon rolling stock to help us get that immediate carbon benefit. And lastly, look to government to enshrine the TDNS, at least the first 15 or 20 years of it, as a firm plan against which we can all invest. Now, if we do that, and as Leo's rightly said, we've then got a rolling programme. And we know, and some of you will have seen this graph before, we have a graph that looks at the mountain range that is the feast and famine of UK electrification. We've got a 20-year gap between East Coast and CP5. And then you compare that with Germany, and they've been shelling out 200 kilometres a year every year for 50 years. Guess who is the most efficient at delivering electrification? And it isn't
just a final last question.
Sorry, Lillian, you've gone on mute.
Sorry, final question, and very quickly. Obviously, I'm conscious that something like Midland Main Line is drawing to a close in terms of the part that's committed. How quickly would you need to make a decision to, for example, extend electrification on that or other projects in order not to lose those staff teams who've kind of developed the expertise? How quickly do we need a decision from government to get this programme going?
Well, yesterday would be good.
Okay. Thank you very much. Back to you, Chair.
Okay, thanks, Lillian. We've got 10 minutes left and we're only just over halfway through where we wanted to be. So I'll ask for sort of quick questions and answers. We're going to go on to the challenges in deploying alternative technologies in the UK. I'm going to hand over to Chris Loader, but Chris, you wanted just to come back in on the last section as well, so please do.
Thank you, Hugh. Just checking you can hear me okay?
Yes, indeed.
Yep, excellent. I just wanted to ask the three witnesses to start with. Network Rail's TDNS, I wondered if you thought it was actually Network Rail feathering its own nest, because for me it looks as though it's looking to preclude some of these great innovations and opportunities, and particularly from a single line point of view where it will almost blow enhancement business cases out of the water for redoubling in the future. I just wondered if you had a view as to whether or not that was the case with the TDNS. Could I ask, Mary, could I ask you first?
No, Chris, I don't believe so. I think that they're recognising where there's routes that are unsuitable for long distance high speed, which of course battery and hydrogen technologies are, and we've got to also still consider freight and freight requirements. So I think they're taking the most sensible approach at looking at the sort of main key arterial routes, looking at speed, looking at gradients, and looking at what that rolling programme should look like. I think there should be some further variations in the periphery, and that's why we need to be ready to support and be able to bring in those technologies, and as we've discussed already. But I think in the main, it is very sensible.
Thank you. Leo, could I ask you next?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's a bit of an unfair characterisation. They've done what they were.
I'm just asking. I'm asking a question. I'm just asking a question. So.
I don't. I think it's a pretty almost comprehensive look at across the different options that are available for meeting the targets that have been set. So.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much, David. What do you think?
I agree with Mary and Leo. I think it's been a good and thorough process. I think one thing to be aware of is that the next stage is what it does is it creates a UK-wide business case to do electrification. The individual projects then go down to the Network Rail regions to be developed in detail. And it's at that level where I would expect them to be looking at the future as you're describing, because as you'll appreciate, you don't want to ossify the existing network. You want to consider whether you need to be, increasing the capacity or making other investment before you put the wires up, preferably. And it's the regions that will understand that and will want to make the case for any enhancements you might want to do prior to electrification.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Could I just go on to ask you what you think the real challenges are of bringing in alternatively fueled rolling stock? Because I think this is a really important point for us to understand. Mary, could I also ask you again first, please?
Sure. The challenges are the long-term commitment. So we've had to take a decision as a business with the support of the organisation to start developing through R&D and delivery now. So we've now spent over 10 million to date on looking at those alternative technologies that have not been committed into any main route at the moment. But if we wait for that commitment, we're going to be too slow, and then there'll be a negativity. So I think it's about confirmation that there is a commitment to alternative technologies and a timeline to get to achieving that.
And can I just ask, would you be looking for government to make that that commitment, or another organisation to make a commitment?
Well, government will need to make the commitment in terms of sort of the future requirements, whatever is going to be post the IRMA, the DAs, whatever the passenger service contracts are going to be. They will specify what they're looking for in terms of type of traction. But as I said, the important thing is actually we're getting on with it now so that we can then actually support government and the department's requirements.
Thank you. Leo, can I ask you the same question?
I guess, again, I would just stress the different alternative traction modes. Hydrogen, the challenges of introducing battery trains are trivial relative to the challenges of introducing hydrogen rolling stock. You can seamlessly, as the TDNS puts it, you can seamlessly integrate into existing electric trains. You can just simply add batteries. Whereas doing this with hydrogen, you've got to have refueling stations. There's a whole new set of infrastructure which would be required to do it. That's
okay. Thank you very much. David.
I agree with Mary. I think the challenge is the long-term commitment, the clarity and the consistency of the commitment. If that's clear and the industry's got confidence in it, then businesses like Mary's will go ahead and develop their plans and invest in this new technology.
And do you think, is there something that the government can do to support this? Do you think?
I think the government has a clear role in setting that framework, and then the industry will operate within that framework. I think it'd also be very helpful if we could get some clarity before too long about who makes the decisions on procuring rolling stock.
Okay. Leo, I'm sorry, I didn't ask you about that point on the government's support.
No, don't worry, we're running out of time, so
yeah,
thank you.
Okay, fine. All right. Chairman, I think it's back to you.
Excellent. Chris, thank you very much indeed. Let's look a little more about the research and development funding, what's been available and what the opportunities are. Sam Tarry, over to you in the room.
Thank you, Chair. Just to bring a little bit of context, good morning to you all. Rail Safety and RSSB Board has a kind of combined funding with Network Rail of about 100 million as part of its innovation fund, and that's 80 million from the DFT and 20 million from Network Rail. There's also the option for the government's innovation agency. That in total its funding in 2020 was about 9.4 million, which is made available, and that's mainly kind of small 100,000 to 400,000 pound grants. My view, if I'm really being honest about that, is that some of that is quite small beer, and the scale and the uptick in terms of development and speed at which we need this technology to be coming on stream to get anywhere near reaching some of the more ambitious targets I would feel would need to see a significant uptick in the investment from government. Particularly, we've obviously got someone here from the Riding Sunbeams kind of innovative project. The amount that those sorts of projects could be funded and could be scaled up far more quickly, I think is really, really where the potential lies. And because, look, I was involved in the rail industry like some other members of this panel, and in the grand scheme of things, even £100 million, when you look at the control periods for Network Rail and the scale of money that's coming in, this is an industry that does cost a heck of a lot of money. And that's not to say it's not good value, but it is something that is intense in terms of the amount of technology, the amount of money that needs to be spent in terms of engineering, design, forward planning over long periods of time. So I wonder if really you could kind of comment on what you think the scale of funding should actually be to really make these technological changes happen more quickly, and perhaps whether that could be done over what sort of period of time that would need to happen. Leo, would you want, perhaps since I mentioned you want to start with you?
Sam. So I agree with Sam. If we really mean to do this, then we need to resource it properly. However, it would be churlish for me to complain because Riding Sunbeams has been a great beneficiary of a number of different R&D funding streams. So, we've been funded by Innovate UK, the Department for Transport under First of a Kind, and we've also been funded by RSSB to do feasibility studies. And we are now in line for the Get Building Fund post-COVID for building a pilot scheme. So I actually want to make a slightly different point about innovation and R&D, which is that the rail sector is notoriously difficult to penetrate as a new market entrant. It's not a friendly environment for SMEs and innovators. It's very, very difficult to innovate in rail, and that isn't just about the funding that's available for doing it. It's also about the requirement to engage with a giant administrative bureaucracy that is structurally geared to maintaining the status quo as tightly as possible, because it's a very, very heavily regulated sector, and that is right because there's critical safety regulations around this. Actually, we've had phenomenal support. So people we speak to in the sector, like Sunbeams, are always kind of astonished at the amount of progress that we've managed to make in the very short amount of time that we've been working on this. And we've had incredible support from inside Network Rail. But we are now, as a business, we're an SME. It's over a year since we commissioned our demonstration scheme, which shows that it is safe and efficient to supply solar directly to the DC traction networks. And we had hoped, by this point, to be building out a scale demonstrator, a scale pilot project, a multi-megawatt solar farm of the type which we are proposing to use to power the railways. This is a market that doesn't exist at the moment. At the moment, Network Rail buys all of its electricity via a single 10-year contract with a big energy supplier. And what we're proposing to do here is a completely different approach, where Network Rail starts to procure power directly from small-scale generators. Now, I don't want to go on about this too long, but where we are now as a business is in the railway valley of death. We've done the innovation, technical innovation. We've overcome those hurdles and we've shown that it works. But Network Rail, despite all the support that we've had from engineers and asset managers and the sustainability team and carbon and energy inside Network Rail, Network Rail is effectively the client for traction power in the UK. They buy nearly all of it. There's TfL and Transport for Wales, who we're also speaking to. But if we're going to make this work, it has to be with Network Rail. And we are now going around in circles with the commercial team to get this Pathfinder project built. So I'm really conscious we're running out of time, but to illustrate, I think, the issue here, actually, it's one of an excessively risk-averse and conservative, small c conservative mindset around procurement. The technical side, we had all the support that we needed, but now, there is actually a provision which we've been pointed at by the Treasury Agency local partnership called an innovation partnership. It's in public procurement protocols, which Network Rail could be using to do a one-off single supplier contract with us to actually get this thing built. But we are going around in circles because Network Rail are like, we have to do this via a competitive tender, but they won't issue a competitive tender if the contract framework is untested. and the technical details are unclear. But until we've built a megawatt scale solar farm, those things will remain unclear. So we're kind of in a computer says no situation, which I hate to say it, is, you know, is something that I hear quite often from other people who've tried to innovate.
Thanks, Leo. That's really interesting. I think that sort of drills down into some of the sort of issues. Certainly, I am familiar with some of the workings of Network Rail. Mary, I just wonder if you could sort of pick up on that wider point about whether you think the scale and current level of government funding for R&D is actually enough to drive that level of innovation that's needed.
For me today, that's a really difficult question to answer, because the short answer is I don't know what that absolute quantum should be. But what I do recognise now, what is important, is the TDNS first framework of changing traction is recognising the commitment of alternative technologies, and that alternative technologies requires R&D and commitment. So at least we're seeing something articulated over a 30-year period. We have not seen that before. I haven't seen that before. We must recognise that Innovate UK are, but in your point, it's small beer, are supporting. We've through hydrogen and after treatment exhaust improvements secured funding to date, but it's relatively small. I think the commitment has to be choose the traction that you want on the routes, and then make sure that the industry, the supply chain and academia and other partners can come together, and that is supported by government, and the right amount of funds are allocated to deliver that.
Thank you. Can I just ask one specifically, would you have any sort of comment around rail freight and whether potentially, because obviously if we were to shift far more goods off of motorways and onto rail, that's clearly been demonstrated over a long period of time that would be a significant shift in terms of decarbonisation. So we haven't spoken much about that already. Have you got any comment on that, particularly within this kind of discussion?
Yeah, and you know, our freight partners today are clearly, you know, they're looking at what the future traction should be in mind of being able to get the length and breadth of the country that they'll carry freight produce. I think there's a number of things that we can do today, though, to support what is currently diesel traction, because they need the power, the actual tonnage of what they're carrying, and diesel is their option today with that fully electrified route. We can clean up those engines. There's a product called Eminox. It's an after treatment. We're doing it on passenger services today. You can do that, but we're also looking at light logistics, which you can use part electrification, part battery. We won't go back onto hydrogen, or Leo will have another point on that, but there are options that can support the decarbonisation challenge whilst we're setting out a roadmap that is as suitable for passenger as it is for freight.
Thank you. And David, just want to turn to you lastly on that question about funding, and if you've got a comment on freight, that would be helpful as well.
On the funding point, I'm not going to discourage you from making the case for more innovation funding, but as Leo says, I don't think that's the biggest issue. The biggest issue is the ability to getting beyond the innovation funding into market, as Leo has well described. So I think the role for government is to try, and indeed for procuring agents like Network Rail, is to create the right environment where innovation can move from the prototype into deployment. And I think that is the real challenge. And as Leo said, there are tools and techniques out there like innovation partnerships to be just one, but much simpler if we think about rolling stock. We now have credible demonstrators out there. So, if there was just a normal commercial tender put out there, the market would respond. We don't need to do any more innovation. We've done that, so let's put some tenders out there.
Okay, thanks very much. Back to the chair.
Sam, thank you. Greg was going to ask about the challenges for Leo breaking into the sort of rail industry, but you've given us a really clear answer on that, Leo, so thank you. So I'm going to move to the final section. Over to you, Lillian, to take us through the franchising and rail industry reform opportunities.
Thanks very much, Chair. So we know, obviously, that the government are reforming passenger service contractual arrangements, and at the moment moving to emergency measures recovery agreements or emergency recovery measures. I can't remember what they're called, the ERMAs. Anyway, and I suppose the question is, how should government use those to incentivise the move to a carbon-free railway, and do the new arrangements help or hinder? I don't know who's best placed to have a go at that to start with. Mary, do you want to have a stab?
Okay. I don't think they help or hinder. I think it's quite simple in terms of whatever we want to achieve, let's just set it out. And then where you have that area that you can control directly, what can you do about it? So within the operating environment of a franchise or contract, whatever they're going to be called, on how you reduce your carbon footprint, or offset it is one part. In terms of the rolling assets, the things that we own and manage in conjunction with our customers, what can we do to demonstrate that the carbon is being reduced, not just for future procurement of rolling stock, but now? And we can demonstrate that. So I think let's just set down some very clear targets and deliverables, and then hold us all to account to achieve those and demonstrate how we're doing that.
Do either David or Leo want to add in terms of the way in which the contracts are run? Because obviously previously under the franchise arrangement, sometimes things didn't really change in terms of rolling stock until we got a franchise change. Is there anything that needs to be done, David?
I think if we've got in place a national strategy in terms of the TDNS, then franchises should be expected to follow that and facilitate it. And whatever process we have for selecting the successors to franchises, they should be bringing forward their plans to meet those targets, and have very, very clear targets for their trajectory of carbon reduction, not just on traction, but across the whole of the franchise that they're going to put in place. And it would be helpful to also bring in initiatives which encourage, so Mary has mentioned another number of examples that we can do to reduce carbon in today's diesels. So more measures to encourage that sort of activity, as well as the introduction of new generation of low carbon trains.
So just build it into whatever form of contracts you've got.
Yes,
is that right?
should be part of day-to-day business, and the businesses should be measured against those trajectories.
Okay, well, my final question then is, obviously the government are due to publish the Williams Review and the Transport Decarbonisation Strategy, maybe before the end of the year, more likely into the new year, it seems. So the question is, what three most important things to support the decarbonisation of the network ought to be in those reports? But in the interest of time, maybe I'll ask you for one or maybe maximum two each. Who wants to go first? Leo, go on then.
Thanks, Lillian. Actually, expanding the rail network. It's very easy to lose sight of the fact that rail is a solution to transport decarbonisation more widely. The focus that we've had in this session and, all of the documents surrounding this in the industry processes is around decarbonising the rail sector itself. But actually, modal shift from road and air to rail is an essential component of an economy-wide transport decarbonisation plan. And it remains to be seen how forthright the Transport Decarbonisation Plan is about the scale of modal shift that is required. But just to get it into perspective, right, if we were able to shift 10% of HGV traffic from roads today onto rail freight, the emission savings from that are equivalent to all of the emissions from the entire rail sector, today. And so in order to achieve modal shift, we have to increase network capacity. So we need to be expanding the rail network. So, that is my number one message. We shouldn't always be on the back foot here, because rail is a solution, even at today's levels of emissions per passenger or per freight kilometre. It's a fraction of the.
So is it a modal shift? Is it a target for modal shift because everything else will flow from it? Because obviously to make that happen requires quite a lot of action.
Exactly, Lily. That is exactly it. I mean, that is what we have proposed in our submission to the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, is that we need a target for an overall reduction in vehicle miles being driven on the UK's roads. It is really, really not clear that it's possible to meet our climate targets. EVs are essential. We have to electrify the remaining road transport, but we also need fewer cars on the road. And this is, this would be a profound reversal of a 70+ year trend. So it's a very, very big deal. And I wait with interest to see how, frankly, the Transport Decarbonisation Plan is able to acknowledge that fact. But it is a fact.
Okay, so that's a one for the transport decarbonisation strategy. Mary, what would be top of your list for what should be in the Williams review or that plan?
So the guiding mind, wherever that sits, let's just get on with it. We've got 30-year strategies we want to bring in for all the reasons we've discussed over the last hour plus. We have to get on with enacting the things that we know that we should be doing to make rail the genuine catalyst for the economic recovery and the future, bearing in mind it is the clean, green, obvious mode of transport. But let's just get on with it because there's a lot to do.
And David, is it going to be the rolling programme of electrification?
Yes, obviously the 30-year strategy is key. A subset of that is a rolling programme of electrification and a plan for introducing low carbon rolling stock. I think another thing I'd look for is a recognition that the supply chain is part of the solution. We've got lots of ideas, we've got lots of capability, and we can invest given the right environment. And that would eliminate the boom and bust, which has sometimes made our delivery inefficient. And the converse is, if we can eliminate boom and bust, we can be efficient. We can give you more railway for the same amount of money.
Thank you very much. Back to you, Chair.
Lillian, thank you very much. Well, that concludes our first session. So, David, I just wanted to thank you and the Rail Industry Association for your evidence. Mary, you mentioned Helen was listening in. Our regards to Helen, and thank you very much for the evidence from Porterbrook. And Leo, thank you again. We were also due to come and visit and see what you were doing, but the November restrictions have taken us out, but we hope we can do that another time. So thanks to all of you, and I wish you all the very best at this time as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Okay, so we now move to our second panel, where we'll be hearing from rail operators, freight experts and fuel innovators. I'll ask each of the panel members to introduce themselves. Let's start with Mark.
Morning, everyone. So I'm Mark Gaynor, Head of Railway Strategy at the Rail Delivery Group. So RDG represents train operators, Network Rail and HS2, but today I'm here really to represent passenger train operators. I'm also a member of the Rail Industry Decarbonisation Task Force.
Good morning, Mark. Thank you for the introduction. Paul, over to you.
So yeah, my name's Paul Smart. I was the long-term managing director of one of the freight operating companies, but retired a couple of years ago, now representing the Rail Development Group's Freight Board, the freight operators in particular, and that's DB Cargo, GB Rail Freight, Freightliner, Direct Rail Services, Colas Rail. I too was a member of the Decarbonisation Task Force. Great,
well thank you, Paul. And finally, Chris.
Good morning, my name is Chris Smith. I am the Managing Director of G-Volution. G-Volution, our mission is evolving towards a zero carbon economy. And our aim is to see the current infrastructure, diesel engines, support cleaner and greener fuels while saving operators money.
Great. Well, thanks to all three of you for being here with us this morning. I should just note that just before 11, I'll suspend proceedings for the 2 minutes silence, and then we'll come back to you. I'll just ask a general question, but if you can keep the answer brief, because we'll dig into the detail. Where do you believe the main focus should be for the government and the rail industry in order to meet the challenge of decarbonising the rail network? Mark, can I start with you?
Yeah, so I think there's already been a lot of good work, and I think your previous session touched on it through the task force, the Traction Decarbonisation Network Strategy. I think what we need now, I think, is a clearer long-term plan that we can all then align our efforts to. And that needs to then be supported by policies on a consistent long-term basis, as well as aligning sort of rail reform to the need to decarbonise, and I can talk about that later.
Thank you, Mark. Paul.
So yeah, I think there's been a lot of talk about electrification and comparisons with battery and hydrogen power, and many people have touched on it already. the strong requirement of the freight segment to have electric traction going forward, I think, needs to be brought to the fore. The other traction methods have some complementary roles, but really a very strong emphasis on supporting the TDNS. I think is an essential part of the way forward.
Thank you. And Chris, perhaps in answering the question, can you also just tell the committee a little bit about your innovative work on dual fuelling and the potential impact that would have?
Happily, yes. So the best way to really see what we do is to spend 2 or 3 minutes watching a video on our website. It's much more eloquent than me to see it. But essentially, we take existing diesel engines and our technology allows them to fuel on 2 fuels at the same time. We have 2 demonstrators out on the network in the next month or 2, one running on diesel LNG and another, which has already run a little, Network Rail running on diesel and bio-LPG. So essentially, we take existing infrastructure and we then can demonstrate that the technology can use cleaner fuels. And we believe that those are lower carbon. We focus more on defossilization rather than decarbonization in that sense. At the same time, we can build an infrastructure around those cleaner fuels whilst providing a payback, which I think is rather central to our message. In terms of the focus that you asked about, the main question here, I must say, and I want to make it very clear that we completely agree with all of the ideas going into the future. What I can't help but notice, having been involved in the industry for a very few years, really just 5, compared to many more eloquent people who've spoken, is that there is very little focus on what has already sunk into carbon existing infrastructure and vehicles. 3,500 DMUs, and I think Paul will correct me, I think it's 632, but a large number of freight vehicles that exist. Those have a long life, and some of them are still being bought. And so, in my view, the focus should be certainly on a long-term strategy, as we've discussed and your other candidates, witnesses have said. But what we also need to think about is what happens now. Everybody has made it very clear. We have to do something now. And we have a technology that exists today and can support the infrastructure of tomorrow. And we'd love to see that as part of the opportunity. Have I gone on too long?
No, look, that's ideal, Chris, and thanks to you all for the opener. We're going to look at a little more detail now into each of the components. So, firstly, with the Rail Industry Decarbonisation Task Force report, and back over to you, Greg.
Thank you, Chairman. I don't know whether witnesses from this panel, and good morning to you all, listened into the previous session, but we had some interesting feedback around the Rail Industry Decarbonisation Task Force report in terms of 16 months on where we are with it. And I'd very much welcome all of your thoughts as well as to where progress is with the recommendations that were in that task force report and where you think the government could be pushing forward faster. So should we start with Mark?
Thank you. So I think in terms of progress that has been made, the Traction Decarbonisation Network Strategy really did emerge from the recommendations that the task force made, and that's been quite a comprehensive piece of work, a lot of cross-industry engagement, and I think at the end of it we now have a high-level roadmap of how to decarbonise the rail network. So I think that's been very positive. I think we were perhaps in normal times would have expected to see more progress around some of the reform elements. We were expecting the Williams Review to have come out by now with what it might say about industry restructuring, incentives and policies to support decarbonisation. So clearly that hasn't happened. So I think now everyone is really waiting to see both what happens around rail reform, but also what the content of the transport decarbonisation plan is, how far that will go in terms of making commitments, providing funding, providing enabling policies to support the delivery of what the TDNS, I think, has quite sensibly set out as a long-term strategy.
Paul, do you have any thoughts on that?
So, I would agree with what Mark has just said, but I suppose the other thing I would add to that from a freight perspective is that the principal report of the task force got as far as concluding that freight is pretty challenging and didn't really get that to a conclusion. Since that report was published, in the background with RSSB, there's been a research project undertaken, led by RSSB, undertaken by Ricardo with industry involvement, that actually then delved into that next layer of what can be done for freight. And it didn't find a silver bullet, but it quantified some of the handicaps in payload and range, which would perhaps have pertained to battery and hydrogen traction. It concluded, as have many other reports, that electrification is the most robust route to achieving decarbonisation. But it did actually delve into that next layer, looking for the silver bullet and quantifying the handicaps of the other modes. So that took quite a long time, and that took quite a long time to actually delving into how much energy a freight train does use getting from A to B. Took quite a bit of triangulation around various parameters to get that agreed, to get Ricardo then to build their models from that. So that has actually been that reported, I think, late summer, early autumn. So that's relatively fresh news in that time.
Thank you. And Christopher, do you have some thoughts on that opening gambit?
My only point about the strategy is that it doesn't contain any reference to cleaner fuels, and other strategies in other countries, Scotland, Spain, Italy, and many other countries I could list, do. What Paul just said is absolutely right. There is a very good report written by Ricardo, and that specifically highlights natural gas as a potential immediate solution. So what I go back to, without sounding repetitive, the point I'm trying to make before is that in the context of the strategy, natural gas exists today, it can incorporate hydrogen within it tomorrow, and it can be part of the infrastructure. And I think that if there's anything missing in my view, it is a common sense understanding of what exists today and what you can do about it today.
Thank you. I mean, from the earlier session, I very much asked witnesses to look and to give their opinions on, in light of what you've just said, how we can be sure when we look at decarbonisation, that particularly when you're setting 10, 20, 30, 40-year strategies and plans, how you can be sure, just as the government back 20 years ago, not just in this country but across the European Union, got it wrong on diesel cars, how we can be so sure, given the emphasis on electrification in a lot of these strategies, that is the right way forward. And whilst hydrogen isn't quite there yet, you can see with some of the brilliant minds that are working on hydrogen and other fuels that those technologies might be there and might be better within a not particularly considerable time frame. So when these strategies are being set, do you think there really needs to be an ongoing challenge to presumptions made in them as technology develops? Just as when all those governments were telling people to buy diesel, they had no comprehension that within 10, 15 years electric cars would actually be not mainstream but certainly more normal on the roads than they are today. How do we apply that to rail?
In my view, I think there's two critical points that you just made. The first is that you already have an infrastructure. You already have got all these vehicles out there. And the Ricardo report that Paul mentioned does refer to doing something about it. The issue maybe from a government point of view as well, that maybe takes some money, but actually in this case it doesn't, because the technology actually saves money. It has on average a 3 to 5 year payback. So I think that's the first thing. You've got a whole load of vehicles. You could do something about it now. Why don't you do something about it now? For example, encourage it or support further innovation with it, or whatever it might be. The second is that the lifetime of a vehicle, again, there's a lot more people more expert than me on this panel, but the lifetime of a freight train can be 40 or 50 years, let alone 30. And therefore it's different from cars in the sense that you can switch from diesel to petrol because your car, maybe 5 or 6 or so, I don't know the average age of the car, but it's a lot less than it is for a locomotive or a diesel multiple unit on the tracks. So these two things combine for me to look just simply more pragmatically at the situation that exists, both in terms of saving money and using the infrastructure. You've already sunk the carbon into all these things. You may well want a hydrogen train, but as the HS2 Coventry earlier said, There's a lot of hydrogen goes into building these things. They're already built. What we then need to do, that's the alarm for the 11 o'clock, it's gone off in my mind anyway. What we need to do is to show that you can bring in the technology now, save money now, whilst evolving an infrastructure for tomorrow, which could include hydrogen, but a lot of other fuels that are not taken into account, like biogas, which is big in the rail and the trucking industry, and bio-LPG, which is becoming quite large in shipping, as well as other biofuels of the future. But I'll shut up because it's 11 o'clock, I think, the chairman to say so, but I believe that we're at the point that I should probably be quiet.
Chris, thank you. We'll come back to this, but I'll suspend for the 2-minute silence and then we will reopen again. So order.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Order. So we return back to our second panel following the 2 minutes silence. Greg, you were partway through.
Thank you, Chairman. When we're looking at the Decarbonisation Task Force report, and indeed as we're looking at any plan to reach net zero by 2050, for the rail sector in particular, Can I ask for your views, please, on whether anything that was in that task force report needs to be re-examined, looked at again in light of the things we know because of the pandemic, the massive drop in rail use, the fact that the railways have basically been nationalised in this window. And secondly, to come back on some of the themes from the earlier session, if you saw it, how do we ensure that when we're talking about long-term decarbonisation plans, we're looking at the whole life cycle, not just of the rolling stock, but of the entire construction phase where we're building new railways? Yeah, HS2 was the example I brought up earlier, but equally East West Rail is being built as a fresh railway at the moment, as are others. How do we ensure that these projects are looking at their contribution to carbon over the long term? We know HS2 is still going to be a carbon contributor after 120 years. It is hardly a green project. How do we roll that into these recommendations and ensure that we're getting this right? Mark, do you want to offer some thoughts on those 2 points?
Yeah, perhaps I'll start with your second point about managing sort of carbon on a whole life, sort of whole system basis. There, I think the challenge is that if you don't measure it, you can't really manage it. But progress is being made. So the rail industry is developing, or has developed, a carbon measurement tool to enable, for example, infrastructure projects to understand how much carbon they're likely to use in terms of materials, concrete, steel, etc. And also then enable them to look at clever ways of designing that carbon out through more efficient use of materials, different materials. So I think that sort of approach, which has been trialled and tested, I think Network Rail have been using it on a number of projects. I think that sort of approach needs to become more widespread so that we are looking not just at the operational carbon as perhaps we've focused on largely, but also the sort of the full life cycle carbon, and that will allow those sorts of trade-offs to be made. And one other point just on that, again, an interesting piece of industry research that RSSB is carrying out at the moment seems to be indicating that actually for the railway as a whole, though that embodied carbon is very significant. So the carbon involved in renewal, sort of maintenance, extension of lines, that is actually quite a significant amount of carbon. So I suspect it is an area we should be looking at as an industry in more detail. On your sort of first point about what's different now, clearly I think that the pandemic has had a major impact on passenger demand. We were seeing it bumping back up to about 40% of normal before the current restrictions came in, and it's sort of fallen again. And I think what was quite worrying as we emerged from the first lockdown was that car traffic, road traffic bounced back much more quickly than rail. And indeed, I was just looking at a study from the RAC this week that suggests that more people plan to drive as we emerge from the pandemic. And even if the greener alternatives are available, transport alternatives, they may be reluctant to use them. Yeah. So I think we need to do everything we can to avoid that sort of car, road traffic-led recovery. And from a RDG perspective, fares reform is a really important tool in the arsenal that train operators have to sort of encourage people to come back to rail by offering them more transparent, more flexible, easier to use fare system. Because if we don't do that, I think people will just go back to using the car.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Paul, do you want to put your thoughts from the perspective into that?
If I may, a couple of remarks from both before and after the 2-minute silence. So, so the point about the sort of dashed diesel cars 15 or so years ago and the sort of regretted post hoc impact there. Of course, electrification has been done at scale before, and we do know there's not actually an adverse post hoc side effect of electrification. So it's slightly, in my view, slightly different to the case with the diesel cars. speaking in terms of the embedded carbon and the comparisons to HS2, clearly we as a freight community won't be, are unlikely to be using HS2. But of course, the whole electrification argument doesn't entail completely rebuilding or building from scratch the infrastructure, but is a modest add-on to an existing infrastructure. So there is the embedded carbon for the electrifications that is contemplated is materially lower than the sort of HS2 example. And finally, in relation to the pandemic, one benefit, if you like, that freight has experienced during some of the suppression of certain passenger traffics is that the sector has been running some very long 770-metre, very, very long freight trains up to the Manchester area, for instance, so that the demonstrate, if you like, a route to less carbon per tonne, even within, again, the existing constraints of the network. And I'm by no means waving a flag for the pandemic, but that's something that has been demonstrated in the shadow of the pandemic as a route to energy improvements and therefore potentially carbon improvement in the future.
Thank you very much. Christopher, briefly, do you want to comment on any of those factors, the pandemic and long-term life cycle?
So on the pandemic, I think my main point would be that if there is something that's fallen into public hands, it would be good to look for cost-effective, immediately available solutions that can support the strategy and the point you made earlier that nobody necessarily knows what will work best going forward. On HS2, I take the point you make about it. From our perspective, it's going to increase the demand for freight significantly. I've heard figures of between 10 and 20%. And again, were those freight locos to run on cleaner fuels, then that would assist at least some of the sunk carbon that you were talking about in the 120-year time horizon.
Thank you very much. Back to you, Chairman.
Greg, thank you very much indeed. So we want to focus now on Network Rail's traction decarbonisation network strategy, and I'll hand over to Lillian Greenwood to take us through this section.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning. So the Network Rail traction decarbonisation network strategy, we're all familiar with it, and it calls for the majority of the rail network to be electrified with the potential for battery and hydrogen sort of at the edges, if I might say it like that. Do you think their findings are right about how those different potential solutions should be applied? And maybe if I come to Paul first.
So yeah, in terms of the sort of core electrification, relative to the constraints of many of the other traction modes that have been looked at, batteries and hydrogen in particular, then I do see that's fairly imperative to driving decarbonisation of the rail freight sector. As I said earlier, I don't rule out a contributory role for some of those technologies at the sort of, if you like, the bookends, the top and tail of a long trunk haul, or indeed bridging between parts of unelectrified network. So there is work to do there. There is potentially even a case, and it's covered in the Committee on Climate Change report, a case in some instances there for perhaps retaining some diesel for bridging those as the most cost-effective solution with possible offset elsewhere in the economy. So I think A, strong support for the findings of TDNS, and B, open mind on those supports around the fringe.
Mark, same question to you, anything to add?
So broad terms, supportive of the TGNS findings. I think what may change is if we get really good at doing electrification and we get the costs down, then perhaps that will enable us to expand the electrification network. But I think we need to demonstrate we can do that. I think one point I'd make is that we mustn't look at the TGNS as just an infrastructure plan. We do need to make sure that we end up with a plan that aligns infrastructure change to rolling stock introduction, to skills, to the supply chain, to make sure it's this very much holistic whole industry change program, which effectively is what it would need to be effective.
And do you think that, well, maybe I'm straying on to someone else's question if I asked about whether the structural changes helped or hindered that. Christopher, can I just come to you really with the same question that I asked the others about the traction decarbonisation network strategy? Supportive or things that they've got wrong?
Well, I'm broadly, as I said at the beginning, supportive of all these changes that bring about decarbonisation. I think if there's one fundamental misassumption there, it is not the adoption of cleaner existing fuels. And by that I mean, as I said, biogas, bio-LPG, which are prevalent in shipping and trucking industries and in many other countries. Partly because they exist today and can be burned, combusted in a diesel engine, and partly because they are part of building the infrastructure of tomorrow. And for those reasons, I feel that there's a fundamental failure to address something which could be done now in the strategy. Having said that, all in favour of the other points that are raised.
Okay, and then my second question really, which kind of picks up something you were starting to talk about, Mark, which is that the Rail Industry Association have suggested that electrification projects can now be carried out a third cheaper than projects in the past, and we all know about the problems on Great Western. Are you confident? Do you that they're right about the more cost-effective electrification?
So I think the Railway Industry Association has done some good work to understand how to deliver electrification at a lower cost, and I think there's some good evidence as well from some more recent projects that we can deliver cost effectively here in the UK. I think a lot of it is around having that sort of pipeline of projects so that we can not try and change the world in 1 year, but do things steadily, efficiently, ensure that we're planning effectively, which I think was one of the big downfalls with the Great Western scheme. So I think if we do have this sort of longer term electrification program, then that's really where I think the opportunities for doing things efficiently will come from. And yes, I am sort of confident, based on what I've seen from the supply chain, that they are able to deliver much more effectively than perhaps was the case with some of the more notorious electrification schemes of the past.
And Christopher and Paul, have you anything to add on that point about efficient electrification?
I would just agree with Mark and save you some time.
Yeah.
Christopher?
I think I'm sure it's right from what I know, which is not enough to really give you an authoritative answer. The only thing I would say is that whether it's right, whether it's wrong, whether it's cost effective, it takes quite a long time to deliver it. And that's really our point.
So that's why there's a need for maybe intermediate technologies while we're getting there.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, immediately available, cost-effective, transitional technologies will help build that plan.
That's great, thank you. Chair, back to you.
Lillian, thanks very much. Chris, if you have a chance, if you can speak a little closer into, sorry. That would be ideal, then we can hear you perfectly. We're going to talk about the challenges in deploying alternative technologies in the UK. We've touched on it, but I'll hand over to Gavin Newlands to go into detail.
Thanks very much, Chair, and Chair's right, we have touched on it, but the Decarbonisation Task Force report recommended that research should be developed to increase the capabilities of batteries and hydrogen. The DFT said that it does not see any specific barriers to the uptake of alternatively powered trains, but that was certainly a view challenged by some of the evidence. So what do you consider, we've touched on one or two, but what do you consider to be the main challenges in deploying alternatively fueled rolling stock, and what can the government do to help? Starting with Chris, I can see he's champing at the bit, so Chris.
Sorry, I was thinking an hour isn't long enough. I would say that there are multiple challenges. I've tried to summarize them briefly in my notes here, but essentially, when you bring clean fuels to the network, there's a very long-winded safety approval process, which costs a fortune. And if we hadn't had help from RSSB, would have been, I think, totally unaffordable. But it's somehow part of the transition that needs to be made for hydrogen. So that question of the safety approval and then some sort of standard for cryogenic and other fuels is a major hurdle and a barrier to entry. Having said that, we have overcome it. I would say that the infrastructure rollout suffers from the same point, where you have a number of places where you need to put clean fuels. Again, can be hydrogen, can be natural gas and hydrogen, can be bio-LPG, whatever it is. The owner of the depot has got multiple people that you have to get approval from, train, etc., and so forth. The overall ownership structure of the industry itself, between the Roscoes, the TOCs, like I said, the infrastructure, the depots and training, they are massive barriers to entry for anything new. And it takes, for me, from outside the rail industry, having even done a feasibility, I've been astonished at the difficulties. Leo put them more eloquently than I have, but I think that we both feel the sense that it is just so difficult. And that's without mentioning the barriers that you get with this kind of a technology anyway, which is kind of the OEM's reluctance to do anything other than kind of what they do, and the reluctance of customers who could benefit from taking on those technologies. So I don't want to go on forever, but hopefully that's a summary of just how tricky it is.
Okay, thanks. Mark?
Yeah, a few points. So reliability, first of all, so introducing new trains in the best of times, it doesn't always go smoothly. So ensuring that there is proper testing and validation before they enter into service. There may be a challenge around higher initial capital cost of some of these new technologies. That may be offset through operational cost savings. So we need to sort of take account of a whole life approach. Whole system, I'm going to bang on about whole system actually. In a number of answers, in that we can't just think about the rolling stock in isolation from everything that needs to go with it to make sure the trains work. So training drivers, making sure you've got maintenance staff who know how the new technology works, appropriate refueling or recharging facilities, depots and stabling facilities, that all needs to be thought about. Different range and performance characteristics. So going from a diesel train, which could run anywhere and provide potentially quite long services, to something that may be more range constrained, or that may accelerate faster or not as fast. That all needs to be thought about in terms of the timetable, stopping patterns. And there's an important element there around engaging with customers to make sure that they understand the rationale for why things might be changing. And I think having that sort of long-term plan, that pipeline of investment, I think that would really help sort of give the supply chain the confidence to invest in the technology, ensure it's reliable, open up opportunities for UK suppliers, and just ensure that stronger engagement across all parts of the rail sector.
Okay, thanks, Paul.
And then very, very specifically on the freight sector, the freight operators are all private companies, and we'll always be cautious about investing in a new technology that's not yet been proven out on the network. The segment, you'll be aware that rail freight is not exactly a license to print money. It's a high volume, low margin business, and getting it fractionally wrong can be quite risky. So again, is it just cause for caution on the way through this? Many of the alternative technologies, all the alternative technologies, to Mark's point, have an impact on power or range, erosion of payload. So there is a sort of fundamental economic upset to be catered for there, which is a challenge going forward. And also there are an awful lot of individual locations around the UK to and from which freight goes, to which future fuels, future charging technologies will need to be applied, relative to a relatively modest number of diesel fuel points where a locomotive will come on, fill up the fuel and go off for a few days of duty. So I think that those represent some of the sort of key challenges applying alternative technologies in the freight segment specifically.
Okay, and in reverse order, and I want, if you can, are you confident the DfT are listening on this issue of the challenges and trying to address them? Go, Paul.
Yeah, I certainly believe the message is being landed, and yes, the work, the research projects which I alluded earlier, the RSSB research interface, again sounded loud and clear these constraints.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Mark, then Chris.
Yep, so very pleased with the positive support from government so far. Need to wait and see what the Transport Decarb Plan says. Really looking for sort of a stable, long-term sort of policy framework and not sort of chopping and changing and U-turns, which just destroys industry sort of confidence. One thing I would say is around appraisal. So the work that the TD&S programme has done has looked at the whole programme business case for electrification and the use of other technologies. There is always a risk when we start looking in more detail at individual projects that they may not stack up particularly well in a traditional business case, but they may be absolutely essential in order to deliver this whole programme. So I think that's an area where, you know, I think DfT needs to recognise that it needs to look beyond just an individual small scheme to, you know, what's the big picture, what are we trying to achieve?
Okay, thanks. And lastly, for a hand back, Chris.
And in my experience, as I've said, not yet, but hopefully it'll be coming.
Okay, thanks. Chair, back to you.
Gavin, thank you very much. Now, we know that rail emits 25% of the CO2 emissions of road freight, but we've also heard about the challenges of rail freight, perhaps holding up some of the innovations. So we'll hand over to Simon to unpack that quandary.
Thank you, Chair. No pressure. And good morning to the panel. Now, obviously, I'm very concerned about the potential distortion to competitiveness of the rail industry and the potential of freight being moved onto road. But how, starting with Paul, should the UK industry meet the challenging threat of decarbonising its rail freight system by 2040?
So I think first off, and it's been touched upon a few times already, that we need to view UK freight as a system, and really seek to encourage whatever modal shift we can towards rail freight within the capacity available now, and indeed to look at short wins to increase that capacity. So it's not to view rail purely in a bubble of decarbonising rail freight, but looking at its contribution to decarbonising the freight sector. I think secondly, there are actually, we've had a lot of conversation about, you know, very large electrification programs recommended, but to use the expression earlier, there are some no regrets schemes on rail freight, which would give some fast avenues to some decarbonisation. So, you know, the Port of Thames Gateway is, I think, less than 2 miles from the nearest wire, but all the trains there leave Dieselholt because they can't get across the 2 mile gap. The Felixstowe branch is, I think, 13 or so miles long. There's a chord in West London which would connect the electrified Great Western to the electrified North London. There are some no regret schemes which would give some quick wins. And then I think we really need to get a shoulder to the wheel behind the electrification programs of TD&S, whilst understanding what alternative technology we would use for the inevitable top and tail at the ends of certain corridors or bridges in the middle where there are going to be gaps in the electrified network, hopefully not terribly long gaps, which will put them within reach of the emerging technologies. Meanwhile, it's certainly not true to say that the industry is not looking at lower carbon fuels, and you know, I know Chris through such endeavours that they are out there, that some of the freight operators are looking at some of those schemes there, and you know, are excited to hear about demonstrations hitting the rails fairly soon to see this stuff in action, which could give us, if you like, some bridging technology to 2040, 2050, and the alleviation of rail freight carbon totally.
Thank you, Paul. You're all aware that the government has committed to publishing what it determines as a cross-modal, I love that phrase, freight strategy this year. How much do you expect decarbonisation to feature in this? And I'll start with Mark.
So, well, it'll be interesting to see, because the department has been talking very eloquently and very passionately about decarbonisation, and you know, it does seem to be at face value, you know, a priority for ministers. So I would expect, I would certainly hope that any sort of freight strategy has front and centre the need to to decarbonise. So that's certainly what I would expect. I'd be quite disappointed if that wasn't the case.
Chris?
Well, I again hope it would be very central for three reasons. One is customers like it, so there's a market reason to have it. Two, it'll save you money. And three, though, is it takes some effort on your part, and you might not necessarily want to invest that effort, as the other two witnesses have mentioned. And I'm hoping that there might be some incentives in that context to, whether it's track access charges, carbon costs, some other way to encourage people that's actually in everyone's interests to do it.
And Paul?
So all I would remind us is that the mission here is to decarbonise the UK economy, or decarbonise within is to decarbonise the freight economy, not specifically just to decarbonise railways. So I think that's important to keep in mind. And yeah, I really would be looking for mechanisms which protect what we do against inadvertent modal shift, just because the timing of implementing something on rail phases differently to implementing something on road. And indeed, that may need to incentivise us to the longer term if we are going to see a permanent uptick in the cost base of rail freight for doing what we were doing historically.
Interesting, thank you. And the entire panel as well, what are your thoughts on a whole system approach to carbon reduction in transport, and how specifically this should be implemented? And this time around, I'll start with Chris.
So I'm really not an expert in this whole system concept, but I've worked a lot in the prime mover, the heavy industry, heavy power sector, if you like, gensets, marine, rail, as well as heavy duty vehicles. And what I can say is that there must be an integration, as Mark said and Paul has said, in terms of cleaner fuels or other infrastructure elements for all of those parts, whether it's a port, whether it's a central rail depot. There needs to be some sort of cross-coordination of these technologies and infrastructural approach. That's really a key part of any kind of change. The infrastructure's got to be linked.
Thank you. And the same question to Mark. Are you confident this will be the case? Apologies for the bell.
The department certainly talked a lot about looking economy-wide at decarbonisation. For example, on the basis that it may be too expensive to take carbon out of one part of the economy, but actually you could over-deliver in another. And I think that's a sensible approach. And I think, just building on what Paul was saying, we don't want to inadvertently penalise rail freight and inadvertently then sort of transfer more freight to road, just because we can't fully decarbonise, say, rail freight itself. So I think we do need to take that holistic whole system approach.
And Paul?
The only thing I'd add to that again is a lot of these conversations might be one of timing. That the HGV road fleet, for example, whatever technology emerges to make this successful, theoretically, it's probably got about 5 or 6 year turnover before all those carbon emitters are renewed for something new. In rail freight, at the moment, it's quite difficult now to order a locomotive because it's difficult to know what one would order now for going forward, and therefore there is a timing point as well as a total cost point, which we just need to holistically manage to make sure we don't create inadvertent adverse carbon consequences.
Thank you. I'll hand back to the chair.
Simon, thank you very much indeed. Before we move on from that segment, I wanted to bring in Gavin Newlands and then Lillian Greenwood. Gavin, first of all.
Okay, thanks, Chair. My point of question is parochial and national. My constituency is home to the Malcolm Group, and they put forward a proposal for a scheme of 48 tonnes for 48 miles, as they called it, which increased the gross vehicle weight allowance from 44 to 48 tonnes within 48 miles of a rail freight terminal to allow for much more intermodal freight transport. Malcolm's forecast this could reduce road freight transport by 70 million gross tonne miles and reduce the associated emissions by 42%. The government have just announced a consultation on a pilot scheme of this very proposal just 2 days ago. Could you, with this proposal, in your opinion, make rail freight excuse me, more practical and cost efficient in addition to the environmental benefits. And
I think the clue is in the name there. If it's close to a railhead, from which the trunk haulage has been delivered by rail, arguably it unlocks greater potential going forward. I guess the nervousness is that the local limit around the railhead gets extended and suddenly becomes the trunk haul, and I think that's my immediate reaction to that is a caveat around where that might play out in the longer term.
Okay, Chris.
I'm really not a great expert in these things, but what you just said in terms of what Malcolm was trying to do made a lot of sense to me, brutally.
Okay, thanks. Mark, have you got anything to add on this before I hand over to Lolly?
I think Paul's answered the question for me as well.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thanks to Lolly, over to you.
Thanks, Gavin. What I just wanted to ask is, if there's a big investment in infrastructure that enables rail freight to decarbonise, so for example via electrification, is there a danger that has an adverse impact on track access charges and therefore affects rail freight's competitiveness vis-a-vis road freight? Or should the government be doing more on track access charges to get a shift from road to rail anyway? I don't know who's best placed to answer that. Maybe Paul, as you were running a rail freight company.
Yeah. So in terms of track, I mean, clearly, whatever infrastructure is put down there, the rail freight haulier won't just be paying the cost of electricity; it will be paying a contribution towards the share of distribution of that electricity. What we would hope and rely on the infrastructure cost of delivery of that electricity not to be out of line with what's emerging now on the existing electrified network, in which case its costs are reasonably well understood and can be and are being priced into electric freight now. So I think that is essentially dealable with from our point of view. Sorry, what's the second half of your question?
Well, just whether the government should, if the government can they use track access charges as a way of incentivising the movement of freight off the road and onto rail, and should they?
We're all aware that on some limited corridors there's already modal shift support for bringing volume onto rail. That is clearly appreciated and can make a difference. I think the other opportunity that electrification brings is the trains can, relative to the diesel trains that they would replace, and where the infrastructure permits, be a bit longer, a bit heavier, so we can squeeze more freight on to make the rail freight half of the contest a little more advantageous, and that clearly is to be encouraged. It's because it's doing what rail freight does best: bigger volumes over reasonably long corridors. So I think there is. Clearly, the sector would welcome any effort to encourage freight onto rail, and defensively to stop adverse movements if the timing and phasing of implementation, as Skip's talking about, mean that road gains a temporary advantage. Let's say we end up dragging volume off the rails.
Mark, is there anything you would want to add on that?
No, other than the general point about aligning all sort of incentives in rail to support decarbonisation. So I agree entirely with what Paul said.
I think I can hand back to you, Chair. Thank you.
Lillian, thank you very much. Just a couple of points I wanted to make, and then I'm going to hand over to Greg, and then finally Sam. So my question is pretty straightforward, so I won't need a lengthy answer. Is how adequate you feel the current level of government support for research and development funding to identify the innovative ways that we've discussed would decarbonise the network. Perhaps if I start with Chris.
So I would answer somewhat like Theo in the way that G-Evolution has been very, very well supported by Innovate and RSSB in our endeavours. Nevertheless, the final breakthrough to engagement is a very difficult thing to do, partly because of the Network Rail and I would say other freight operators' reluctance to adopt cleaner fuels for reasons that are, rational and understandable, but ultimately lead to no change happening. And the kind of, why would we take that risk approach? So I think the funding for innovation is good. If we were able to put onto the rails tomorrow a demonstrator which would cost, £1 or £1.5 million for a freight loco to demonstrate, 50% fuel cost savings, 30% or more carbon savings, if we could get the money to do that, having got to this point, that would be a great help. But I would say generally, the structure of the UK innovation financing could be greater because rail is so expensive and difficult, but it is very well targeted, and I think it's run by incredibly impressive people generally.
Good. Thank you, Chris. That's interesting response back. Mark, over to you next.
So I think sometimes it can be quite difficult, and I think we've heard about this on the previous session, for people with innovative technologies to actually be able to engage with the railway and then get access to a live rail environment to test and trial. So I'm sure we could make that easier to make best use of available funding. I think one thing I have sort of noticed is sometimes when, for example, the department is running a broader low carbon program, perhaps through the Office of Low Emission Vehicles, sometimes it's not possible for rail to get involved. So maybe that is something that could be looked at to make sure that whenever DFT in particular is running a innovation or research initiative, that there's an opportunity for rail to engage.
Thank you. And Paul, is enough of the R&D budget being devoted towards decarbonising rail freight?
I think, again, as other people have said, we could always use more. And I'm aware of a couple of schemes looking actually at alternative fuels which managed to fail to get Innovate UK support and in competition and lost out to non-rail schemes. So there is more to do. To actually supporting Chris's point, it might mean that some of the funding needs to be slightly more generous and quicker, so that we can actually put a real demonstrator out in the network, because there is nothing like the ability to kick the tires. This is a low margin business. People have got extremely busy day jobs, and seeing something demonstrated for real is worth 1,000 papers and submissions and technical drawings. So more power behind the other of actually building something. Show it off and let's see it.
Okay, thank you very much. Greg, over to you.
Thank you. Christopher, I think this is particularly a question for you. I'm very keen to see, as is the government, SMEs getting a fair crack at access to innovate, to provide the innovation that we need. Looking back through history, some of the biggest technological advances we've seen of things that improve our day-to-day lives often get invented, created, discovered by smaller enterprise, if not in someone's shed, to start with. Can I ask you, as an SME, what challenges have you faced entering the rail industry, and how could the government actually make it easier for SMEs to break into this market properly?
So I don't want to overstate, because I work as a part of a team. It is an incredibly challenging environment, as Leo mentioned more eloquently than me, the rail environment. And it's very difficult, I think, for the government to do much more than what they do, except for three things, which I would clearly identify. The first is the scale of funding that you need, focused on rail, which enabled the demonstrator, as Paul said, is a hugely valuable thing. We've actually spoken to the Rail Minister and the DFT and been put in touch with a state-owned rail company to see if we could encourage them to do a demonstrator. But that is something which could, we targeted that as an idea because it would really help us. So I think it's the scale of the fund and the ability to demonstrate something for a reason. Here I'm saying to you, use this technology now. We've done papers on it, as Paul said, extremely good research papers for the RSSB showing the demonstrated benefits. But there's nothing quite like seeing is believing. And if you watch that video for a couple of minutes, if I could impinge on your time for that, you'll see what we mean. If you see it, you believe it could happen. And if we could do that on scale, that would be an immediate step forward. The second thing would be to include us in a strategy. So if I'm saying, and I'm not saying that's because I'm not saying you should agree with me, but my feeling is that clean fuels, we have a lot of experts in the Advanced Propulsion Center, in the IEA, who accept that cleaner fuels are part of this transition, both for immediate, available transitional technology and for the infrastructure of tomorrow. So I think putting it into a structure would be good. And the third thing would be, in that context, to try to see that decarbonisation, or we prefer to say defossilization, because that's kind of more of the focus of the cleaner fuels, will benefit the operator in more than, I mean, you would have thought that a fuel cost saving of 30% would be enough to encourage people to change. But actually, my experience is that a large number of people will say, well, we're going to run those diesel engines for the next 20 or 30 years, and then we'll just turn them off. We're not, why would we take the risk? So it's a little bit what Leo said. You're kind of stuck in a cycle of, can't you see the benefit? No, it's not really enough. And I would criticize myself here. When I started this business 10 years ago, I thought, well, surely if you're making the world a better place, you're saving carbon, you're saving yourself money. Isn't that going to motivate you? And the honest answer in a lot of these situations, bizarrely, and for lots of different reasons, it's not. Life would be a lot easier without customers, you could say, in response. And I accept that that's part of the criticism. But if you wanted to ask me what the government could do, those three things are key.
That's really helpful, and mindful of time, I'll pass back to the Chair.
Greg, thank you ever so much. Let's look at franchising and rail industry reform. Sam Tarry, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Obviously, the recent, the plans that are going forward for a government white paper, the Williams review, we are going through a huge period of change, and the COVID crisis has obviously impacted on the railways in a dramatic and huge way, meaning that essentially the railways have been almost partially nationalised, in my view. So just thinking forwards about potentially moving out of the COVID kind of period, how do you think the government can actually begin to think about reforming passenger service in terms of contractual arrangements, but in a way that would actually incentivise carbon-free railways? Perhaps do you want to just take that in order, perhaps with Christopher going first?
So I'm really no expert on franchising at all, but what I would say is that this goes back to part of the point of this whole session, I think, is how do you get holistic change to occur? And my own feeling is that if there was some legislation around carbon, incentives around carbon, which were properly measured and universally applied, that is the best way to drive that change, along with everything else we've talked about.
Thank you. Paul, would you like to make a comment on that?
Truthfully, I've got no real locus to comment on the future organisation of how passenger services are let out, so I think I'll pass on that one.
Mark, over to you in that case.
Thank you. So I think I mentioned in an earlier answer the need for alignment. So I think we do need this decarbonisation plan. It's not just about infrastructure change, it's also about ensuring that train operators play their part, whether that's through the introduction of new rolling stock or energy efficiency initiatives. So I think we do need to see sort of targets, incentives sort of running down to train operators. It is interesting that before the current pandemic, we were already seeing a change in travel patterns, travel behaviours, with a move away, for example, from sort of traditional sort of 5-day-a-week commuting into major cities, and the pandemic has obviously accelerated that, and I think we can expect to see some ongoing permanent changes in how people want to live and work. So as I mentioned earlier, I think there is a need to ensure that our fares and ticketing sort of systems keep up with those sorts of changes. So I know there are some constructive discussions taking place between the industry and government around flexible season tickets. And I think that's good, but we'd argue you need to go further to give operators the tools to be able to maximise, make best use of the capacity that they have, and encourage people to get back onto the railway by offering good value, easy to use, flexible fares.
In terms, obviously, of companies might be sort of bidding for future contracts, where it probably won't be in a franchising system, but there probably will be some process for people to participate and bid as private enterprise. Do you think that there could be things that are built in that actually would challenge those companies and therefore incentivise them to actually come forward with proposals? I mean, could the government actually be saying, well, look, if you want to bid and then be successful in winning one of these new contracts in whatever shape they end up taking, that perhaps these are also criteria that have to be built into those new agreements?
So I think my view on that would be absolutely. We really do want to, we should be looking to harness innovation, get new ideas, encourage ambitious proposals to come forward, and we would certainly see that as a really important theme that the private sector could bring to bear in any future management contracts. Absolutely.
Do you think that's been made more difficult by the current emergency measures, recovery agreements?
So I think that the limited sort of length of the IRMAs and a lack of clarity at this stage about what will happen next, inevitably, it's quite hard to judge, what impact the successor to the IRMAs will have until we see more about the detail through whatever comes out from Williams and wider rail reform thinking.
Christopher, did you want to make any comment on that? I saw you nodding away there.
Well, I just wanted to say, thank you, that from my perspective, there were in some recent franchises, carbon targets, and I think they are a very good way to encourage change, and I think they are part of what I was talking about, track access, carbon tax, try to get a holistic response to the whole situation. I also think they need to be measured quite carefully, because if they are put on a sort of kilo per passenger basis, then more passengers gets you your carbon target, which isn't quite kind of where we're coming from. But in principle, I think it's a very good way to drive change. Okay.
So obviously the government likely to publish Williams' review in the transport decarbonisation strategy in the next few months. Do you think you could think about what 3 most important things would be that would support decarbonisation across the network that should be in those reports? Chris, do you want to start on that, and we could just go through everyone?
For me, they are the use of cleaner fuels immediately, the development of a shorter-term strategy, 5, 10, 15 years, to create an infrastructure and some sort of benefit, carbon tax, track access, whatever, to those who take the routes around decarbonisation.
Okay, thanks very much. That's very interesting. Could we go to Paul? Would you like to make a comment on that at all? Particularly maybe from a freight perspective.
So perhaps I've got 3 things. I would go back to the sort of no regret wins, the short bits of electrification could uncork quite a lot of opportunity for freight decarbonisation. I would want to have mechanisms that really maintain or prevent disparity between road and rail while we go through the transition, just because of the phasing and timing things I spoke about earlier. And in terms of the new structure of the network operator, a sort of familiar statement from the freight community, but we need to have our needs viewed as a corridor from A to B, not aligned to the devolved geographies of Network Rail's potential future structure. So it really is just to make sure we've got a guiding mind and an ability to influence at the corridor level rather than regionally.
Thanks, Paul. That's really helpful. And lastly, would you come back to the rail delivery group, Mark?
Yeah, so just building on Paul's point, so we would very much want to see the creation of an independent guiding mind or arm's length body, so a body that could sort of take, if you like, the strategic objectives of government, turn that into a whole system plan. So, encourage Network Rail to get on with the sort of the electrification plans, ensure that whatever came through in the future of franchising was aligned to that, and hold people to account for delivering. But also, as Paul said, sort of take that sort of network view. Is the whole railway network working? Because trains don't necessarily just travel within a network rail geography. They travel through and across all parts of the country. So you need to make sure that happens. Other thing touched on before, sort of I mentioned it again, sort of fares reform and then carbon target and incentives, in particular making sure those flow through into the future of franchises.
Okay, thanks very much. Chair, back to you.
Sam, thank you very much. I should just add that the Trains Fit for the Future inquiry is always designed to look not just at how the trains are actually powered, but also what the passenger experience will be like on board that train. Now, of course, that's a particularly challenging point with the COVID pandemic and the concerns of passengers. Could I just ask Mark, very briefly, because we will wrap up, what changes you'd like to see in the design of trains to improve the passenger experience, both to boost passenger numbers, but also to improve accessibility for passengers?
Yeah, and just picking up on what you were saying about sort of the pandemic and how that's changing sort of passenger expectations. So, you know, I think we're really trying to focus on demonstrating that it is safe to travel by train, that we are doing an awful lot around sort of cleaning, ensuring sort of people wear face coverings, providing as much space as possible on trains. But I think that also sort of feeds into future design. So the industry is working with government, very closely with government, is looking at how can we ensure that ventilation systems, filtration systems on trains are effective against viruses like COVID-19, but potentially future pandemics. The use of materials that are inherently resistant to viruses, and ensuring the design of the train itself makes it conducive to cleaning. So I think that's perhaps something we weren't thinking about so much, a year ago, but it is very much in the industry's thinking now. In terms of design, I think some of it's around sort of getting the basics right. So, providing a safe and secure environment. So good lighting, level access, ensuring there's provision for wheelchair users that isn't compromised by other potential usage in the travelling environment, the ability to communicate with staff if there are any issues, ensuring that visually it's easy to navigate the train and find out where things are. We know that customers increasingly want real-time information, not just sort of within the train itself, but if they've been booking trains using their mobile phone, that they get sort of personalised information to them, and that information can not only talk about where the train's going, but provide information on availability of toilets, where there is more space in the carriage, which I think again will become increasingly important. Something that the industry is also exploring is around flexibility of the use of space on the train, and I can see that might be something which we spend even more sort of time thinking about, given how people's travelling patterns may change. So, for example, could we have reconfigurable interiors that can provide higher capacity at times of the day, but then sort of can be modified to provide a more comfortable experience, in the off-peak. Whether also that means we can be more accommodating of bicycles, to support the increased move towards active travel. And I know, and Paul will be pleased to hear this, I know that there's also interest in how we can perhaps use spare capacity on passenger trains to carry freight, high value freight into and out of city centres. That's been done sort of on a sort of pilot, small scale so far, but I think there might be opportunities to do more of that in the future. So a few initial thoughts, but yeah, I think the pandemic is something we will need to think about very carefully in terms of how we design rolling stock going forward, and also the need to understand better the needs of our customers and their future travelling patterns and what they need from rail.
Well, look, Mark, thank you very much for just giving us that insight as we look into that part of the inquiry a little further, and we will do so. Can I thank you very much, Mark, and also Paul and Chris, for allowing us sort of glimpse into the future and what's possible, and also very fitting that we were able to pay tribute to all of those that gave us the freedom to do just that over the decades previous. So thank you very much, and we'll look forward to continuing this inquiry. Order, order.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.